The Nazis were the architects of mass murder and the most meticulous record keepers the world had ever seen. Their entire system, built to last 1,000 years, was a fortress of steel, paperwork, and unwavering venomous confidence. And their fortress was broken by a single quiet woman they considered to be a piece of furniture. It was in the summer of 1940, in the Jeu de Paume Museum in occupied Paris. Along the western edge of the Tuileries Garden, this beautiful, ornate museum became a hideous slaughterhouse for European culture. It was the central nervous system for the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. Nazi art squad with a name as bureaucratic as their brutal methods. Stolen Rembrandts, Degas and Van Goghs arrived daily, stripped from the homes of Jewish families, waiting to be sent to Hitler's massive, vanity-fueled private museum in Linz. Every painting stolen was a family erased, a history rewritten, and a culture declared unworthy of existence. Deep within its marble halls, one woman was entirely invisible. She was Rose Valland, a French art historian and an unpaid assistant curator. She came from the countryside. She was a woman, and she held no rank. By every measure of Nazi ideology, she was useless and a non-entity. They gave her access to their most sensitive operation because they believed she didn't speak a word of German. That was their first mistake. They saw an obedient mouse and a fixture with no rank, no influence, and no weapon. They missed the weapon that poverty had created. And in the next 4 years, this overlooked woman would do something so impossible that it would ultimately break the back of the most powerful theft machine the world has ever known. To understand what Rose Valland did, you must first understand what she was not allowed to be. Rose was born in Saint-Étienne de Saint-Joire, a tiny village southeast of Lyon. Her father was a blacksmith, a man who shaped metal on fire. And this mattered because in the rigid, hierarchical world of French art history, where access was only granted by wealth and family name, Rose Valland was a walking mistake. The French art establishment of the 1920s was a gentleman's club. It was dominated by men from old families, men who collected art because their grandfathers had collected art, men who saw the curation of beauty as their birthright. And a woman from the provinces whose father hammered iron for a living had no business in their marble temples. But Rose had something they didn't: obsession. By autumn of 1931, she had earned multiple degrees, a master's in art history from the École du Louvre, another degree in archaeology, and even a certification to teach drawing. She had better credentials than most professionals in her field. She had studied under the best minds in France, so much she could identify a Renaissance brushstroke at 20 paces. She knew more about Flemish oil techniques than most of the paid curators at the ERU Louvre. But she had 3 unforgivable strikes against her in the world of Parisian curators. She was a woman, she was poor, and she didn't have the right name. When she finally got her foot in the door at the Jeu de Paume Museum in 1932, it wasn't as a paid staff member. It wasn't even as a junior curator. It was as an unpaid volunteer, which is what the French system politely called an attaché bénévole. She was essentially the art world equivalent of an intern, except she wasn't even getting school credit. Nonetheless, Rose juggled her museum duties with her daytime teaching job at a girls' school in Paris, all while pursuing further studies in architecture and fine arts. She was running on pure obsession, driven by a deep, almost spiritual dedication to art history. The male curators barely noticed her. She was the woman who opened the doors in the morning. She was the assistant who catalogued the smaller exhibitions. And the person who filed the paperwork no one else wanted to touch. She spent 8 years as a ghost in the museum's halls, studying its inventory, learning every painting, every sculpture, and every crack in the wall. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which storage rooms had the best light and the birthplace of pieces that hadn't been displayed in decades. May 1940. The German army crossed into France like a tidal wave of steel. The French military, despite all its expert planning and its fortifications, collapsed in 6 weeks. The politicians fled, the generals surrendered, and Paris, the city of light, went dark. When the German tanks rolled into Paris on June 14, 1940, the arrogant, wealthy French museum directors were long gone. They had evacuated the Louvre's most precious treasures, the Mona Lisa. The staff left behind to mind the empty museum were the low-rank essentials, the people considered too unimportant to evacuate. And among these workers was Rose. The Nazis didn't see Rose, the poor, ignored curator, as an asset. They certainly didn't. They saw an assistant who stayed because she had no connections to flee. They saw a quiet country girl with bad clothing and no family name, a woman who could barely afford her rent, let alone a train ticket to safety. And they had just given her the keys to their entire, meticulous, secret operation. By October 1940, the Jeu de Paume had been transformed. The Nazis requisitioned it as the primary sorting depot for the ERR, the organized looting division run by Alfred Rosenberg, one of Hitler's chief ideologues. The mission was simple and monstrous. They confiscate all art owned by Jews, strip it from their homes, catalogue it, and redistribute it to the Führer's collection, Hermann Göring's private hoard, or German museums. This was opportunistic theft, as well as an industrial-scale cultural genocide with perfect German efficiency. The man in charge was Baron Kurt von Baer, an aristocrat who treated the operation like a corporate merger. Under him were art historians, SS officers, and a small army of German clerks. They processed an average of 100 crates per week. Every item was photographed, logged, assigned an inventory number, and marked for a specific destination. The Nazis were so confident in their victory and so certain of their permanence that they documented everything. They created albums of photographs showing the confiscated art, typed manifests in triplicate, and stamped official seals on every crate. They were creating a perfect historical record of their theft because they believed they were the good guys, the saviors of culture from the degenerate influence of Jewish ownership. And standing in the corner, silent and forgotten, was Rose Valland. The Nazis were now telling the Jews they had no right to their history and their very existence. But while she was forced to work alongside her enemy, Rose began her own secret war, an audacious act of quiet defiance that carried a guaranteed immediate death sentence. The action was simple, repetitive, and lethal. While the German officers carefully logged their theft, the inventory book 1, lot 402, destination Munich, Rose was creating her own secret counter-record of the crime in plain sight. She didn't use a radio. She couldn't touch the crates or make obvious copies of the manifests. Her weapon was purely mental. Every time a German officer barked out a new destination or the coded number of a crate destined for a mountain bunker, she memorized it. Every time she transcribed a Nazi list as part of her assigned duties, she would add, in a hidden place in her notes kept at home, the exact origin and destination, all while feigning a complete inability to understand the German tongue. The Nazis assumed she spoke no German, and this lie became her greatest shield. The German officers, feeling safe in their language, would openly discuss shipping plans, destinations, and the prized Vermeer destined for Hermann Göring's dining room right in front of her. Rose, standing still at her desk, arranging files, hearing everything, became a perfect, silent listening post. She was collecting the laundry while secretly compiling the definitive map to the biggest treasure hoard in history. She created a shadow archive, a ghost inventory that existed only in her memory and in the pages she kept hidden beneath a floorboard in her apartment. The danger was constant and suffocating. If a German officer had simply asked her a direct question in German, her cover would have been blown instantly and she would have faced an immediate firing squad. The penalty for espionage was death, and what she was doing was espionage of the highest order. Every day, for 4 years, she held the secret of the entire Nazi art operation in her head and in her hidden notes. She watched Hermann Göring himself visit the Jeu de Paume 20 times during the occupation. He would strut through the halls in his ridiculous uniforms, pointing at paintings like a child in a toy store. And every night she went home to her tiny apartment and wrote it all down. The names, the numbers, the destinations, the crimes. By the summer of 1944, the impossible was happening. The Allied forces had landed at Normandy. The Germans, who had built their fortress to last 1,000 years, were watching it crumble in 4 years. Paris, which had been dark for so long, could suddenly see the light at the end of the tunnel. But for Rose Valland, this was not a moment of relief. This was the moment of maximum danger. Because the Nazis, in their record-keeping minds, understood one terrible truth. If they couldn't have the art, no one could. And more importantly, if the art survived, it would be evidence. Evidence of their crimes that would be used in war crimes tribunals. The same bureaucratic obsession that had made them document everything now made them want to destroy everything. On August 1st, 1944, with Allied tanks just weeks away from Paris, Rose witnessed something that made her blood run cold. German officers arrived at the Jeu de Paume with crates, hammers, and a new set of orders. But they weren't packing art to send to Germany. They were packing explosives. The plan was simple and devastating: to burn the paintings, blow up the railway cars, and erase their 4 years of systematic theft. If the Nazis couldn't win the war, they would at least win the cover-up. Rose watched as they began loading the most valuable pieces into railway cars bound for Germany. But these weren't normal shipments. If the trains couldn't reach Germany, if they were about to be captured by Allied forces, the German guards were to destroy everything inside. This was the whole point of her 4-year mission. She had documented everything. She had memorized every destination. But what good was a map to a treasure if the treasure was about to be burned? This was her Colmar pocket, her burning tank destroyer. She had spent a while collecting intelligence, and now she had perhaps days, maybe hours, to make that intelligence matter. The problem was this: she had the information, but she had no way to use it. The French resistance was fragmented, focused on sabotage and street fighting. The Allied forces were still pushing through Normandy, miles away, and she couldn't radio for help. She didn't have a radio, and she couldn't send a letter because the mail system was controlled by the Germans. But Rose Valland had spent 8 years being invisible before the war and 4 years being invisible during it. She knew how to wait. But she also knew that the moment the Germans left, she would have to move faster than she had ever moved in her life. August 16th, 1944. The liberation of Paris was beginning, but it was chaos. French resistance fighters were battling German holdouts in the streets. And at the Jeu de Paume, the last German convoy was preparing to leave. Rose watched from a window as German soldiers loaded 3 railway cars with crates marked "Property of the Reich." But she knew the actual content of those crates. 148 paintings, including 5 Rembrandts, 8 Rubens, and a Vermeer that had been stolen from the Rothschild collection. The train was scheduled to depart that night, heading east toward Germany through the rail yards at Le Bourget, and then Aulnay-sous-Bois. The German commander, Wilhelm von Müller, was nervous. Paris was falling. He had orders to get the train across the border before the city was fully liberated. If he failed, he was to detonate the explosives that had been carefully placed in each railway car. Rose knew all of this because she had listened. She had stood in the shadows while von Müller barked orders in German, convinced the quiet French woman at the desk couldn't understand a word. As the last German truck drove away from the museum, Rose didn't celebrate. She ran. She ran through streets where gunfire still echoed, passing burning vehicles and French resistance fighters setting up barricades. She ran to the one person she had been quietly feeding information to for months. A resistance liaison named Alexandra Rosenberg, son of the art dealer Paul Rosenberg, whose entire collection had been looted by the Nazis. She found him in a safe house, bent over maps and planning the next day's operations. When she burst through the door, out of breath, covered in dust from the street, he barely recognized her. She delivered the news in a rush. The train would move that night from Le Bourget. 3 cars, packed with explosives. A single shot at destroying everything the resistance had been working toward. Alexandra stared at her. He had known Rose was gathering information, but he hadn't understood the scale, because these weren't rumors or hunches. She had exact details: the departure time, the route, the number of guards, the location of the explosives. This was the piano wire fix. The moment when the mechanic who had spent 4 years diagnosing the problem finally had the tools to fix it. Alexandra made the call. Within hours, a team of French resistance fighters and Allied officers were racing toward the Le Bourget rail yards. But they were too late. The train had already left, heading northeast toward the German border. But Rose had also given them something the Germans never expected: a map. She told them the exact route the train would take, where it would refuel, and most importantly, she told them that there was a narrow window, perhaps 18 hours before the train crossed into Germany and was lost forever. The Allied command made the decision to stop the train, but not to blow it up. It was a surgical operation, not a battlefield engagement. They couldn't just bomb the tracks. They had to intercept it, neutralize the guards, and disable the explosives without destroying the cargo. On August 17, 1944, at 3 a.m., a combined unit of French resistance fighters and American soldiers ambushed the train near the town of Soissons, just 60 miles northeast of Paris. The German guards surrendered without a major fight. The explosives were carefully disabled. And when the Allied soldiers opened the crates, they found exactly what Rose Valland had told them they would find. 148 paintings, intact, saved from destruction by a woman who had memorized their existence 4 years earlier. But this was just one train. Rose's real work was only beginning, as Paris was. Liberated, Rose did something that shocked the French authorities. She didn't go home. She walked into the offices of the newly formed French Commission for Art Recovery and presented them with a document that would change everything. It was her secret notebook, 4 years of recorded data, 4,174 individual crates containing over 100,000 works of art, systematically looted from 203 French collections. She had the names of the families they were stolen from. She had the Nazi inventory numbers. She had the destinations: Munich, Berchtesgaden, Neuschwanstein Castle, and, most importantly, the Altaussee Salt Mine in Austria. The French officials, who had never taken Rose Valland seriously before the war, stared at the notebook in stunned silence. This was not just intelligence. This was a complete map to the Nazi art hoards. This was the master key to the largest art recovery operation in human history. Within weeks, Rose's intelligence reached the Monuments Men. This was a group of art historians, museum directors, and scholars who had been recruited by the Allied forces to protect and recover cultural treasures during the war. They were good at their job, but they had a massive problem. They didn't know where anything was. The Nazis had shipped art to hundreds of locations across occupied Europe. It would take decades to find it all, if they could find it at all. And then Rose just handed them a roadmap. Captain James Rorimer, an American art curator who would later become the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, met Rose in Paris in September 1944. And she told him about the Altaussee Salt Mine. This was the crown jewel of Nazi art storage, a massive salt mine in the Austrian Alps, where the Germans had hidden over 6,500 paintings, including Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, Vermeer's The Astronomer, and Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, one of the most significant artworks in Western civilization. But Rose had another piece of information that Rorimer found chilling. The mine was rigged with explosives. In March 1945, as the war was entering its final months, Hitler issued the Nero Decree. Named after the Roman emperor who burned Rome, the decree ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure, the factories, the bridges, and the railways. This was to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. And in the twisted logic of Nazi ideology, this included art. If the Reich was going to fall, Hitler wanted to take European culture with it. The man tasked with executing this order was August Eigruber. In early April 1945, Eigruber ordered the placement of 500-kilogram bombs inside the Altaussee mine. The plan was to collapse the mine, bury the art under tons of rock and salt, and ensure that if the Nazis couldn't have it, no one could. But Rose Valland's intelligence had already reached the Allied command. They knew about Altaussee, they knew about the explosives, and they knew they had to move fast. On May 3rd, 1945, just days before the German surrender, American soldiers from the 3rd Army's Monuments Unit raced toward Altaussee to stop the demolition before Eigruber could give the final order. When they arrived at the mine, they found something unexpected. The local Austrian miners had already disabled the bombs, but they had only known to act because word had reached them through the Monuments Men, armed with Rose Valland's intelligence. When the American soldiers entered the mine, they found a cathedral of stolen culture. In the cool, dry salt chambers, perfectly preserved, were over 6,500 paintings. The The walls were lined with crates marked with Nazi inventory numbers, the same numbers Rose had memorized. There were statues from Italian churches. There were entire library collections stolen from Jewish scholars. It was the largest recovery of stolen art in history, and it never would have happened without the quiet French woman who had spent 4 years taking notes. Rose's 4 years of silent intelligence work directly led to the recovery of over 60,000 works of art. Not all of it. Thousands of pieces are still missing, sold on the black market, destroyed, or hidden in private collections. But those 60,000 pieces would have been lost forever. When the war ended, the survivors of the Holocaust came home to find their families dead and their homes empty. The Nazis had taken everything: their possessions, their dignity, their very identity. For many survivors, the only proof that their family had ever existed was that their mother had loved Impressionist paintings, and that their grandfather had been a collector was the art that Rose Valland had tracked. The French government, with Rose's intelligence, was able to return thousands of these works to their rightful owners. A Degas returned to the Rothschild family. A Monet returned to the family of Paul Rosenberg. A small sketch by Toulouse-Lautrec returned to an elderly woman in Lyon whose entire family had been murdered at Auschwitz. Rose Valland didn't save 60,000 paintings. She saved 60,000 memories. But the one part that history forgets is that Rose did all of this while still being unpaid. Even after the liberation of Paris, after she had handed the French government the intelligence coup of the century, she was still officially listed as a volunteer curator. It wasn't until 1945, after the recovery of Altaussee, that she was finally given a paid position with the French government. In 1947, she was awarded the Médaille de la Résistance, France's highest honor for resistance fighters. And in 1948, the United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor America can give to a foreign national. By 1953, she was made a commander of the Legion of Honor. But despite all these medals, all this recognition, Rose Valland never became famous. She never wrote a best-selling memoir or went on lecture tours. She gave a few quiet interviews, published a modest book called Le Front de l'Art in 1961, and then retreated back into obscurity. She spent the rest of her career working for the French Commission for Art Recovery, tracking down stolen art. She never married. She never sought the spotlight. She just kept working, kept searching, kept fighting to return stolen memories to broken families. She died in 1980 at the age of 81, largely forgotten by the public. The art world knew her name, but the average person had never heard of Rose Valland. In 1964, a Hollywood film called The Train was released, starring Burt Lancaster. It was a fictionalized account of the French resistance stopping a Nazi train loaded with stolen art. The film was a hit, praised for its suspenseful action sequences and its moral clarity about the importance of preserving culture. But the film changed one critical detail. The hero was a man, a French resistance fighter named Labiche, who single-handedly stopped the train through force and cunning. Rose Valland, the actual person who made the train's interception possible, was reduced to a minor background character, a museum curator with barely any lines. Hollywood, like the French art establishment before it, couldn't imagine that the real hero of the story was a quiet, unglamorous woman who never fired a gun. But the people who mattered knew. The monuments men knew. The families who got their art back knew. The survivors of the Holocaust who could prove their families had existed, they knew. And in 2005, 25 years after Rose Valland's death, the French government finally gave her the recognition she deserved. They renamed the street in front of the Jeu de Paume Museum Place Rose Valland. Now, every tourist who visits that beautiful building in the Tuileries Garden, every art lover who walks through its doors, walks past her name. The woman the Nazis thought was furniture is now part of the architecture. But perhaps the greatest tribute to Rose Valland isn't a street name or a medal. It's this: because of her work, because of her refusal to be invisible, over 100,000 works of art were documented, tracked, and in many cases recovered. The Commission for the Compensation of Victims of Spoliation, established in France in 1999, still uses her records today. 75 years after the war ended, families are still finding their stolen art, still proving their histories, because Rose Valland wrote it down. She was the mechanic who fixed the plane that no one else could fix, the weapon the experts never saw coming. If you found this hidden story as powerful as we did, hit that like button. And for more forgotten heroes who broke the rules to change history, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss an upload.